She disappeared after the vampire king chose another. Now he's tearing the city apart to find her. I will always choose you, he had once promised, his voice like velvet over steel. Until the moment you don't, I whispered back to the memory, watching him slip the ring onto Gwendolyn's finger. Silas thought he could have his queen for the kingdom and his muse for the night. He thought I would wait in the wings, grateful for the scraps of his soul he hadn't bartered away for power. But he forgot the one lesson I taught him about love. It cannot exist in the dark. So, as the cheers for the new royal couple shook the chandeliers, I turned to the open door and stepped into the storm, leaving behind a silence louder than any scream. The grand hall of the Winterborn Citadel was not designed for comfort. It was designed to make mortals feel small. The architecture was a predatory thing, arches that swooped like bat wings, obsidian floors that mirrored the guests like a dark lake, and chandeliers dripping with crystals that looked suspiciously like frozen tears. Valeria Stonebrook stood near the periphery, disguised by the shadows she had learned to call friends. She wore grey, dove-grey silk that clung to her frame, humble yet dignified. It was the colour of clouds before a storm, a stark contrast to the sanguinary crimsons and midnights worn by the vampire aristocracy surrounding her. Tonight was the ascension, the night Silas Winterborn would solidify his rule over the fractured clans by choosing a consort. For 2 years, Valeria had been more than a scribe in his library. She had been his anchor. She had seen the monster weep dry, bloodless tears. She had bound his wounds with silver-laced gauze when the hunters got too close. There had been nights, quiet and heavy with unspoken things, where the air between them crackled like a coming storm. He had never promised her a crown. Valeria was human, frail, temporary, but he had promised her truth. "He looks weary," a voice murmured beside her. Valeria didn't turn. She knew the cadence of Sebastian Ravensford, the king's left hand. "He looks like a king, Sebastian. Weariness is just part of the costume." "He searches the crowd for you," Sebastian noted, his voice low, a rumble of thunder trapped in a chest. "You should be closer." "I am exactly where a human belongs," Valeria replied, her throat tight, "in the background." At the head of the room, upon the dais carved from the bones of ancient leviathans, stood Silas. He was terrifyingly beautiful, a masterpiece painted in sharp angles and cold marble. His hair was the color of falling snow, his eyes a piercing, unnatural violet that seemed to burn with an inner, cold fire. He wore the heavy velvet mantle of his station, but his hands, pale, strong hands that had once held hers with surprising gentleness, gripped the arms of his throne until the stone cracked audibly. The crowd went silent. The air pressure dropped. Silas stood. His gaze swept the room, a predator scanning the herd. For a heartbeat, his eyes locked onto the shadowy corner where Valeria stood. The connection was visceral, a physical blow to her chest. In that split second, she saw panic in his immortal eyes. She saw an apology, and that was when she knew. "The pacts must be honored," Silas's voice rang out, amplified by the acoustics of the hall. It was a voice that could command armies or seduce saints. "The stability of Aoria requires unity between the bloodlines." He extended a hand. Not toward the shadows. Not toward her. He extended it toward the woman standing in the center of the light. Gwendolyn Frosthall. Gwendolyn was everything Valeria was not. Ancient, powerful, her skin glowing with the faint iridescence of the pure-blooded. She wore a gown of woven silver that looked like armor. She stepped forward, her expression unreadable, and took Silas's hand. "I choose Gwendolyn Frosthall, Silas declared, the words final as a coffin lid slamming shut. The room erupted in polite applause, the sound like dry leaves skittering on pavement. Valeria didn't gasp. She didn't cry. The pain was too absolute for that. It was a cold, clean severance. She saw the way Silas looked at Gwendolen, not with love, but with a grim, shared understanding, a strategic alliance. He had chosen power. He had chosen to secure his throne, and in doing so, he had relegated Valeria to a secret, a mistress, a weakness to be hidden away in the tower. Valeria turned. Valeria, Sebastian warned, stepping in front of her. Don't do anything rash. He creates this alliance to protect the city, to protect you from the Elder Council. I don't need his protection, Sebastian, Valeria whispered, her voice trembling only slightly. I needed his faith. She slipped a small object from her pocket, a ring of twisted iron he had given her, a token of an old promise, and pressed it into Sebastian's cold palm. Give him this. Tell him. Tell him the cage was beautiful. But I prefer the sky. Before the applause died down, before Silas could look back to the shadows to reassure himself that his little bird was still there waiting for him, Valeria Stonebrook turned and walked out the heavy oak doors. She didn't run. She didn't look back. She simply vanished into the rain-slicked night, just as the first toast was raised to the king and his new queen. Inside the hall, Silas dropped Gwendolen's hand the moment the ritual bow was complete. His eyes snapped to the corner. Empty. The glass of wine in his hand shattered, red liquid exploding over his white cuff like a fresh wound. The music stopped. Find her! Silas snarled, the mask of the composed king slipping to reveal the monster beneath. Now! Aoria was a city built on verticality. The vampires lived in the spires, crystalline towers that pierced the smog, catching the moonlight. The humans, the workers, the forgotten, lived in the roots, the labyrinthine streets at the bottom, where gas lights flickered, and the fog tasted of coal and old secrets. Valeria moved through the roots with a purpose she hadn't felt in years. She had stripped off the dove-grey silk in a public lavatory 3 blocks from the citadel, trading it for heavy trousers, muddy boots, and a thick woolen coat she had stashed days ago. She hadn't known he would choose Gwendolen, not for certain. But Valeria was a scholar of history, and history taught that kings rarely chose hearts over crowns. She had prepared. You're late, a voice hissed from the darkness of an alleyway behind a butcher shop. Valeria didn't flinch. The ceremony ran long, Quentin. Quentin Highmore stepped into the halo of the gaslight. He was a rogue, a smuggler of magical artifacts, and a man who owed Valeria a life debt. He looked like a scarecrow made of wire and bad decisions, with a cigarette permanently glued to his lip. Did he do it? Quentin asked, taking the heavy satchel she handed him. He did. Quentin spat on the cobblestones. Bastard. All of them. Cold blood. Cold hearts. You got the payment? Valeria reached into her tunic and pulled out a small vial. Inside, a single drop of glowing crimson liquid suspended in oil. Vitae. King's blood. She had stolen it from a bandage months ago, preserving it. To a sorcerer or a black market alchemist, it was worth more than the citadel itself. Quentin's eyes widened. You're crazy. If they catch you with that... They won't catch me, because you're going to get me out of the city, Quentin, through the old sewers, past the wards. The wards are keyed to your heartbeat, Val. Winterbourne has you tagged like a prize falcon. Not anymore. Valeria pulled down the collar of her shirt. On her collarbone, a patch of skin was raw and red. I used the caustic paste you gave me. The tracking sigil is burned off. It hurts like hell, but I'm off the grid. Quentin looked at her with a new respect. You really are done with him. "Drive," she said, climbing into the rusted carriage he had waiting. Before the bells ring. Back in the citadel, the celebration had turned into an interrogation. Silas Winterbourne sat on his throne. But he was not relaxed. He was a coiled spring. The grand doors were barred. The guests, nobles, ambassadors, clan leaders, were terrified. Sebastian approached the throne, his face pale. He opened his hand, revealing the twisted iron ring. Silas stopped breathing. The air in the room grew so cold that frost began to crawl up the windows. He took the ring, his fingers trembling with a rage so profound it looked like calm. "She gave this to you?" Silas asked, his voice barely a whisper. "She left, my liege," she said. "She said the cage was beautiful, but she preferred the sky." Silas closed his fist over the ring. The metal groaned. "She thinks I did this to cast her aside," Silas said, staring at nothing. "She thinks I chose Gwendolen to replace her." "Did you not?" Sebastian asked carefully. Silas stood up, and the shadows in the room lengthened, transforming into distinct, grasping claws. "I chose Gwendolen because Augustus Eldamore demanded a sacrifice. He demanded a human life to seal the treaty. If I had not chosen a vampire consort, the council would have demanded Valeria's execution by sunrise to purify the court." Silas descended the stairs, his cape billowing like smoke. "I did this to save her life, and now she is out there, unprotected, with no mark, no guard, thinking I betrayed her." He turned to the trembling assembly. "The wedding is postponed," Silas roared, the sound shaking the dust from the rafters. "Tear this city apart! Search every cellar, every attic, every ship in the harbor. If she is hurt, if she is scared, if a single hair on her head is harmed, I will burn Aoria to the bedrock." Gwendolen Frosthall watched him from the side, sipping her wine. She didn't look jealous. She looked impressed. "Finally," she murmured to herself. "A king worth fearing." 3 days had passed. The city of Aoria was under martial law. The vampire guard, the Nox Eterna, patrolled the streets in armored carriages. They tore through the market districts, overturning stalls, scanning faces. Every human woman with dark hair and pale eyes was stopped, questioned, terrified. Valeria was nowhere near the markets. She was deep in the industrial sector, a place where the smog was thick enough to chew. She was staying in a safe house, provided by Quentin, a room above a clockwork repair shop. The constant ticking of thousands of gears below helped drown out her thoughts. She sat by the window, peering through the grime-streaked glass. She looked different. She had cut her long, dark hair into a jagged bob and dyed it a harsh, chemical blonde. She wore oversized mechanics coveralls, but she couldn't disguise the ache in her chest. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Silas. Not the king, but the man. She remembered the way he would read poetry to her in the bath, his voice rumbling through the water. She remembered how he refused to drink from her, afraid his beast would take too much, contenting himself with blood bags so he could simply hold her without hunger. "Stop it," she whispered to the empty room. He made his choice. A knock at the door. 3 sharp raps, then 2 slow. The signal. Valeria unlocked the heavy deadbolt. It wasn't Quentin. It was a woman. She was cloaked in heavy wool, but the hood fell back to reveal striking features, sharp cheekbones, eyes like polished jade, and ears that tapered to delicate points. Sylvia Evercrest, a courtier, a friend of Gwendolen. Valeria went for the knife in her boot, but Sylvia raised her hands. "Peace, little bird. I'm not here to drag you back." "How did you find me?" Valeria demanded, backing away. "You smell like him," Sylvia said simply, stepping inside and closing the door. Silas's scent is woven into your very soul, Valeria. Ancient cedar, blood and ice. You can burn off a sigil, but you can't scrub off the king's claim. Anyone with a nose for power can track you. Valeria leaned against the work table, her heart hammering. Does he know? He's tearing the spires down, Sylvia said, a hint of amusement in her voice. He executed 3 members of the Merchant Guild this morning because they delayed a search party. He isn't sleeping. He isn't feeding. He is unraveling. He chose Gwendolen, Valeria said stubbornly. He chose a shield, Sylvia corrected. She reached into a cloak and pulled out a heavy envelope. It bore the seal of House Frosthall. Gwendolen sent me. Valeria stared at the letter. Why would his betrothed help me? Because Gwendolen has a lover in the West, Sylvia revealed, her voice lowering. She doesn't want to marry a mad king any more than you want to watch him do it. She wants you to leave, Valeria, truly leave. If you stay in the city, he will find you. And if he finds you, the Elder Council will kill you to save him from his distraction. Sylvia placed the envelope on the table. There is a ticket for the midnight train to the Iron Coast. It leaves in 1 hour. And there is a glamour charm to hide your scent. Why help me? Because in a world of immortals, true passion is rare. And what Silas has for you, it's dangerous. It will consume us all if it isn't tempered. Sylvia turned to leave, but paused at the door. Run, Valeria. Run far, because if he catches you, he will never let you go again. Valeria stared at the ticket. The Iron Coast was beyond the jurisdiction of the vampire kings. It was a human territory. Safe. She grabbed her bag. She took the charm, a silver locket, and clasped it around her neck. Immediately, the heavy, oppressive pressure of the city seemed to lift. She ran. She moved through the shadows of the rail yard, the steam from the engines hissing like serpents. The midnight train was a massive iron beast, bellowing smoke. She showed her ticket to the conductor, a gargoyle of a man who didn't look twice at her. She found her cabin. 3rd class. Cramped. Perfect. As the train began to lurch forward, Valeria felt a sob catch in her throat. It was over. She was free. Suddenly, the train screeched. Metal ground against metal. The momentum threw Valeria against the wall. The train came to a violent, shuddering halt. The lights in the cabin flickered and died. Silence. Then, the sound of heavy boots walking on the roof of the train car. Thud. 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 A voice amplified by magic boomed through the quiet night, shaking the rivets of the carriage. Valeria! It was Silas, and he sounded like a man who had stared into the abyss and decided to jump. The door to her carriage didn't open. It was ripped off its hinges. Standing in the corridor, illuminated by the red emergency lights, was Sebastian Ravenswood. And behind him, stepping out of the shadows with eyes that glowed like dying stars, was Augustus Eldermore, the leader of the Elder Council. But it was the figure pushing past them that stopped Valeria's heart. Silas. He looked wrecked. His pristine suit was torn, his hair wild, his face gaunt with hunger and panic. He spotted her huddled in the corner. He didn't shout. He didn't rage. He simply collapsed to his knees at the entrance of her cabin, as if the strings holding him up had been cut. "Found you," he breathed, the sound broken. Valeria scrambled back, pressing against the cold window. "Stay back, Silas, I'm leaving." "You can leave," Silas whispered, crawling forward, ignoring the presence of the elders behind him. "You can go to the Iron Coast, you can go to the moon, but you do not go without me." "You have a queen," Valeria spat, tears finally spilling over. "I have a political arrangement," Silas roared, the sudden volume making the glass crack. "I have a treaty. but I do not have a heart without you." "My lord," Augustus Eldermore interrupted, his voice like dry parchment. "This has gone far enough. The girl is a liability. You have abandoned the ascension ritual to chase a stray pet. This is grounds for abdication." Silas froze. Slowly he turned his head to look at the elder. The look on his face was not human. It was ancient, demonic, and utterly devoid of mercy. "Abdication?" Silas stood up slowly. "You think I care about the crown, Augustus? You threatened her life. You forced my hand." Silas moved faster than thought. One moment he was standing. The next, he had Augustus by the throat, pinning him against the steel wall of the train. "I am the king," Silas hissed, his fangs fully extended, "not because of a crown, but because I am the strongest thing in the dark, and if you ever try to take her from me again, I will drain this entire council dry." He threw the elder aside like a rag doll. Silas turned back to Valeria, extending a hand. It was bloody. It was shaking. "I am not asking you to come back to the cage, Valeria," he said softly. "I am asking you to let me fly with you. If you leave, I leave. The throne can rot." Valeria looked at his hand. Then she looked at the terrified elders in the corridor. Then she looked at the open door leading out into the night. The train was surrounded, not by guards, but by something else, shadows that moved independently of the light. "Silas," she whispered, looking past him. "We aren't alone." A window shattered. A canister rolled into the cabin, hissing green smoke. Hunter's bane. Verbena gas. Silas roared, covering his face, stumbling back as his skin began to blister. Valeria didn't think. She lunged, not for the door, but for him. She grabbed his burning hand and pulled him down, covering his body with hers as the cabin filled with the choking fog. The hunters had arrived, and they didn't care about crowns or love. They only cared about dust. The world didn't end with a bang. It ended with the hiss of gas and the screech of tearing metal. Valeria's lungs burned as she dragged Silas through the shattered window of the train carriage. The King of Night, usually a monolith of unshakable power, was heavy, dead weight against her shoulder. The verbena gas, Hunter's bane, had done its work. His skin, usually pale marble, was blistered and grey, his breathing a jagged rattle. "Leave me," Silas rasped, his voice a ghost of the command that could level cities. His eyes were squeezed shut, weeping blood. "Run, Valeria." "Shut up," she grunted, hauling him over a twisted rail tie and down the steep embankment into the dense tree line of the Blackwood forest. "You don't get to die, noble. Not after chasing me halfway across the continent." Behind them, the train was a skeletal ruin, wreathed in green smoke. Shadows moved through the fog, hunters clad in filtration masks and leather armor, their flashlights cutting beams through the toxic haze. They moved with military precision, sweeping the wreckage. Valeria didn't look back. She knew the geography of the Iron Coast borderlands. She had studied the maps in Silas's own library. There was a decommissioned mining outpost 3 miles north. They moved like a 3-legged beast, stumbling over roots and slick moss. The rain had started again, icy and unrelenting, washing the soot from Valeria's face, but doing nothing to cool the chemical burns on Silas's neck. "Valeria." Silas stumbled, his knees buckling. He hit the mud hard. She dropped beside him, her hands hovering over his shoulders, terrified to touch the burns. "Get up. We can't stop." "I can't see," he whispered, turning his face toward her voice. The admission shattered her. Silas Winterbourne, who saw in the dark, who saw through lies, was blind. "I'll be your eyes," she said, grabbing his lapels and pulling him up with a strength she didn't know she possessed. I'll be your eyes, Silas, but you have to be my legs. Move." They walked for hours. The adrenaline began to fade, replaced by a bone-deep cold. The sounds of pursuit, the baying of hounds, the crack of rifles, faded into the distance, swallowed by the immense, ancient silence of the Blackwood. By the time they reached the mining outpost, the dawn was bleeding grey light through the canopy. The outpost was little more than a cluster of rotting shacks and a collapsed mine shaft. But to Valeria, it looked like a palace. She kicked open the door of the foreman's shack. It was dry. It smelled of mildew and coal dust. She helped Silas to a corner, arranging a pile of old burlap sacks. He collapsed onto them, shivering violently. His healing factor was fighting the poison, but without blood, he was losing. Valeria barred the door with a rusted shovel. She slid down the wall, her head between her knees, trying to remember how to breathe. "Are they gone?" Silas asked from the shadows. "For now." "Good." A pause. "You should have let the gas take me." Valeria looked up, her eyes flashing in the dim light. "And let the council win? Let them rewrite the story, where the king dies a tragic hero and the human girl is just collateral damage?" "No." She crawled over to him, reaching into her pocket for the small, heavy vial she had stolen from the citadel, the single drop of king's blood she had planned to sell for her freedom. She uncorked it. The scent of ozone and iron filled the small shack. "What is that?" Silas's nostrils flared. "Insurance," she murmured. She tipped the vial against his cracked lips. "Drink." It wasn't enough to heal him fully, but as the drop hit his tongue, the grey cast of his skin receded slightly. His breathing deepened. "Why?" he asked, his voice stronger. "Because," Valeria whispered, brushing a wet strand of hair from his forehead, "I'm not done yelling at you yet." Plot twist. As Silas drifts into a healing sleep, Valeria notices a symbol burned into the wood of the shack's doorframe. It's not a mining symbol. It's a fresh carving of a broken crown, the insignia of a resistance movement thought to be extinct for 50 years. Someone has been here recently. Someone who hates kings. Fever dreams were rare for vampires, but the verbena had stripped Silas's mind raw. He tossed on the burlap, muttering names of people dead for centuries, his hands clawing at invisible enemies. Valeria sat by his side, keeping watch through the cracks in the boarded-up window. She had scavenged rainwater in a tin bucket and used the last of her clean tunic to wash the soot from his wounds. By midday, the fever broke. Silas opened his eyes. The violet fire was dim, but the blindness had passed. He stared up at the rotting wooden beams, then turned his head slowly to find Valeria cleaning a rusted knife she'd found. "You look terrible," he said, his voice rough. "You look worse," she countered, not looking up. "Where are we?" "Old mining shack, Sector 4, about 10 miles from the Free City's border." Silas tried to sit up, wincing as his skin pulled tight. "We need to move. Augustus will send the airships." "He won't," Valeria said calmly. "Not if he wants to keep this quiet. If he deploys airships, the other clans will know he lost control of his king. He's hunting us quietly, which means we have time." Silas stared at her. He looked at the soot on her cheek, the resolve in her jaw, the way her hands didn't shake despite the terror of the last 24 hours. "I'm sorry," he said. The words hung in the dusty air. Valeria stopped scrubbing the knife. She finally looked at him. "For which part? The engagement? The gas? Or for telling me you loved me, and then proving that love was secondary to your ambition?" "It wasn't ambition," Silas said, sitting up fully now, ignoring the pain. "It was survival. Augustus found out about your lineage, Valeria. Valeria froze. My lineage? I'm a baker's daughter from the roots. That's what the records say. But your blood? Silas hesitated. Your blood sings in a way that shouldn't be possible for a commoner. Augustus believes you are a descendant of the sun-touched, the ancient line of hunters who could walk in daylight and kill us with a touch. He demanded your execution. Marrying Gwendolen was the only way to buy enough political capital to pardon you and send you into exile safely. Valeria stood up, the knife clattering to the floor. You lied to me. You made me believe I wasn't enough just to save me. I would burn the world to save you, Silas said intensely. I would be the villain in your story for 1,000 years if it meant you lived to read the end of it. I don't want a savior, Silas, Valeria shouted, the emotion finally boiling over. I want a partner. You took my choice away. You decided my life for me. I am a king, Silas roared back, standing up to meet her, staggering slightly. Deciding lives is what I do. Not mine, she hissed, stepping into his space, poking a finger into his chest. Never mine. They stared at each other, breathing heavy, the air charged with anger and the undeniable magnetic pull that had always existed between them. Silas reached out, his hand hovering near her face. I am not a king anymore, Valeria. Not out here. Out here, I am just a dying man who chased you onto a train because the thought of an eternity without you was more terrifying than the sun. Valeria's anger deflated, leaving only exhaustion. She leaned into his touch, her forehead resting against his chest. We are in so much trouble, she murmured. Catastrophic, he agreed, wrapping his arms around her, burying his face in her hair. But we are together. A twig snapped outside. Silas went rigid. Valeria grabbed the knife. Through the cracks in the wall, they saw movement. Not hunters. A lone figure walked into the clearing. She wore a long leather duster and carried a heavy, modified crossbow. She had wild red hair and a scar running through one eye. I know that woman, Silas whispered, tension coiling in his muscles. That's Talia Withorn. Who is she? The best tracker in the hemisphere, and my ex-fiancée from a century ago. Plot twist. Talia doesn't raise her weapon. She walks right up to the door and knocks politely. Open up, Silas. You look like hell and you're bleeding on my property. The standoff inside the shack lasted 3 seconds before Silas recognized the futility of fighting. Talia Withorn was not someone you fought when you were at half strength. Valeria opened the door. Talia stepped in, surveying the scene with a critical eye. She looked from the disheveled king to the fierce human woman holding a rusted knife. Cozy, Talia drawled. She tossed a medical kit onto the table. You've got verbena poisoning, Silas. You need pure blood, not that swill you buy in the city. Why are you helping us, Talia? Silas asked, leaning against the wall for support. Last I checked, you swore to mount my head on your wall. I still might, Talia smirked, pulling out a chair and straddling it. But the bounty on your head is insulting. Augustus offered 50,000 gold marks. For a king, it's tacky. Augustus put a bounty on me? Silas asked, his eyes darkening. On both of you. Dead or alive, but the fine print heavily implies dead. He's spinning a narrative that you've been mentally compromised by a human sorceress. Talia winked at Valeria. Nice work, by the way. No one has made him run a mile in 50 years. I didn't use sorcery, Valeria said defensively. Honey, you made a king abdicate his throne and jump on a moving train. That's magic, whether you cast a spell or not. Talia's expression sobered. But here's the problem. It's not just the council hunting you. The Iron Lotus is on the move. Silas paled. The Fanatic Guild? They were disbanded. Reformed, Talia corrected, and they have a new backer, someone with deep pockets and inside knowledge of the Citadel's defenses. Gwendolen, Valeria guessed. Smart girl, Talia nodded. Gwendolen isn't the victim here. She's the architect. She knew Silas would run. She counted on it. Now that he's abandoned the throne, she's ruling as regent. And her first act was to sanction the Iron Lotus to cleanse the rogue elements. Valeria felt a chill. The woman who had looked so cool and detached at the ceremony had played them all. We need to get to the Free Cities, Silas said. I have safe houses there. You'll never make it, Talia said. The Lotus has the border locked down. But there is another way. I'm listening, Silas said. The underground river, Talia said. It runs beneath the mountains, straight into the heart of the neutral territory. It's dangerous, full of things that have evolved in the dark, but it's unpatrolled. Why help us? Valeria asked again. What do you get out of this? Talia stood up, her hand resting on her crossbow. I get chaos, darling. Aoria under Gwendolen will be boring. Aoria with a returning king fighting a civil war. That's good for business. She kicked the door open. We leave at dusk. Try not to die before then. As Talia walked out to secure the perimeter, Silas turned to Valeria. The underground river, he muttered. I've heard stories. Leviathans. Sirens. Better than Gwendolen, Valeria said. Valeria, Silas took her hand. If we go down there, we disappear. Truly. If we survive, we can start over. No crowns, no politics, just us. Valeria looked at him. She saw the hope in his eyes, but she also saw the fire of vengeance smouldering beneath it. Is that what you want, Silas? To disappear? Or do you want to take your city back? Silas looked at the door where Talia had exited, then back at the woman who held his heart. I want you safe, he said. That wasn't the question. Before he could answer, a deafening boom shook the earth. The roof of the shack groaned. Mortars! Talia shouted from outside. They found us! Valeria grabbed her bag. Silas grabbed Valeria. Change of plans! Talia yelled, kicking the door back in. The river is too far. We have to go up. Up? Silas demanded. The sky lift. Talia pointed to the top of the ridge, where an old ore transport cable disappeared into the clouds. It goes to the high peaks. We can jump to a passing airship if we time it right. That's suicide, Silas said. That's Tuesday, Talia grinned. Run! They sprinted out of the shack just as a mortar shell obliterated it. Debris rained down, wood, dirt, and fire. They scrambled up the rocky incline, slipping on shale. Below them, the forest swarmed with soldiers in silver armor, Gwendolen's personal guard, not the Iron Lotus. She sent her own, Silas growled, his speed returning as the adrenaline spiked. He scooped Valeria up in his arms. Hold on. He blurred, moving with supernatural speed up the cliff face, Talia struggling to keep up behind them. They reached the rusted platform of the skylift. The wind was howling here, freezing cold. An ore bucket, rusted and groaning, hung on the cable. Get in, Talia ordered, firing a bolt into the chest of the first soldier to crest the ridge. Silas deposited Valeria into the bucket and turned to help Talia. Go! Talia shouted, reloading. I'll hold them off. No! Valeria screamed, reaching for her. I don't do teams, princess! Talia laughed, a wild sound. She pulled a lever, and the bucket lurched, swinging out over the abyss. As they drifted away into the fog, Valeria watched Talia Withorn draw a second sword, standing alone against a wave of silver armor. Then the clouds swallowed them. Valeria sat back in the bucket, shivering. Silas wrapped his coat around her. She sacrificed herself, Valeria whispered. No, Silas said, staring into the white void. She's buying time. Talia doesn't die. But we have a bigger problem. He pointed upward. Emerging from the clouds, descending directly toward their fragile cable bucket, was the flagship of the royal fleet, the Obsidian Queen. And standing on the prow, looking down at them through a spyglass, was Gwendolyn Frosthall. She wasn't chasing them to kill them. The bucket jerked to a halt. The cable had been clamped. Gwendolyn's voice, amplified by speakers, cut through the wind. "Bring my husband home, and throw the girl." Silas looked at Valeria. He looked at the drop, thousands of feet into the rocky, jagged peaks below. "Do you trust me?" Silas asked, his eyes locking onto hers. Valeria looked at the ship, then at him. "Always." "Then take a deep breath." Silas grabbed the rusted rim of the bucket, his muscles straining, veins popping in his neck. With a roar that echoed like thunder, he didn't pull them up. He ripped the bucket off the cable. They plummeted into the freefall, gravity taking hold as Gwendolyn's scream of rage faded into the sky above. Gravity is a cruel mistress, but the wind is a thief. It stole the breath from Valeria's lungs as they plummeted through the cloud layer, the Obsidian Queen shrinking into a black scar against the grey sky above. The world became a blur of rushing grey and white, the roar of the air drowning out even the frantic thudding of her own heart. Silas didn't scream. He didn't flinch. He simply twisted in the air, a maneuver that defied physics, pulling Valeria into his chest and wrapping his body around hers like a cocoon of marble and velvet. He was taking the impact. He was choosing to break so she wouldn't have to. "Close your eyes!" he roared over the wind, his voice a solid anchor in the chaos. Valeria buried her face in his coat, smelling the ozone, the metallic tang of his blood, and the faint, lingering scent of the cedar soap he used, a domestic memory in the face of oblivion. She squeezed her eyes shut and waited for the end. It didn't come as a crunch of bone on rock. It came as a shattering cold. They hit the water, the subterranean river Talia had spoken of, with the force of a meteor. The surface tension was like concrete, but it broke under their combined velocity. They plunged into the freezing, crushing darkness of the underground current. The cold was absolute. It seized Valeria's muscles, threatening to stop her heart instantly. The water was pitch black, turbulent, and thick with the taste of deep earth. The roar was deafening, a chaotic symphony of churning rapids and grinding stones. She felt Silas's grip loosen slightly, the shock of the impact likely shattering his focus, perhaps even his bones. "No," she thought, panic flaring brighter than the dark. "I will not lose you now, not after everything." She kicked, fighting the drag of her heavy boots. She grabbed his collar, her fingers numb and clumsy, and pulled. The current was a beast, thrashing them against slick cave walls, dragging them deeper into the mountain's roots. Something large and scaled brushed past her leg, a reminder that this river belonged to things that had never seen the sun. But she didn't recoil. She held on. Then, a bioluminescent glow appeared ahead, a cavern, vast and echoing, lit by patches of glowing moss and crystals. Valeria gasped for air as they broke the surface, coughing up water that tasted of minerals and ancient dust. She saw a shoreline of black sand and jagged stalagmites. With the last of her strength, she kicked toward it, dragging the dead weight of the Vampire King with her until her knees scraped against the grit. She collapsed onto the sand, heaving, her body shaking so violently her teeth clattered. Beside her, Silas lay still. Too still. "Silas?" She crawled over to him, her voice cracking. His coat was shredded, revealing the pale skin beneath. His left arm was bent at a sickening angle, clearly broken. But it was his face that terrified her. He was translucent, the veins beneath his skin standing out in stark relief, black and spider webbing, pulsing with a necrotic rhythm. The water. It wasn't just water. It was silver-laced runoff from the deep mines above. "Silas, wake up!" She pressed her hands to his chest. No heartbeat. But vampires didn't beat like humans. They hummed, and his hum was fading, like a dying engine. "Valeria." The whisper was barely audible, a dry rustle of leaves. I'm here. She framed his face with her freezing hands. "Leave me," he breathed, eyes fluttering open. The violet fire was gone, replaced by a dull, milky grey. The silver, it's in the water, it's in the marrow now. "Then we get it out," she snapped, tears hot against her freezing cheeks. She ripped the hem of her wet shirt, tying it around his arm to set the bone. He didn't even grunt. That was bad. It meant his nerves were dying. "You can't fix this," he murmured, his hand reaching up to touch her face, his fingers ice cold. Gwendolen won. The crown, the prophecy. It was always going to end like this. "Screw the prophecy," Valeria yelled, her voice echoing off the cavern walls, startling the bats nesting high above. "You don't get to quit. You jumped off a mountain for me, Silas Winterborn. You don't get to drown in a cave." She needed heat. She needed fire. But everything was wet, and the cold was seeping into her own bones. Then she remembered. The sun touched. Silas had said her blood sang. He said she was a descendant of hunters who could walk in the daylight, whose very essence was anathema to the night. Augustus had wanted to kill her for it. Valeria pulled the rusted knife from her boot. She looked at her palm, then at Silas's grey, fading face. "Trust me," she whispered, her voice trembling not from cold, but from hope. She sliced her palm diagonally. The cut was deep. The blood that welled up wasn't just red. In the darkness of the cave, it seemed to shimmer with a faint, golden inner light. It looked like liquid dawn. She pressed her bleeding hand to his mouth. "Drink." "No," he groaned, turning his head away, his instincts warring with his love. "It will kill me. Sun-touched blood is poison. It burns, or it's the cure," she insisted, forcing his jaw open gently. "We're rewriting the story, remember? Drink." Silas yielded. As the first drop touched his tongue, he arched his back, a guttural cry tearing from his throat that shook the stalactites. Steam rose from his skin where the blood touched him. His veins glowed gold, then red, then settled back to a vibrant, electric blue. The black spider webbing of the silver poisoning receded, burned away by the potency of her lineage. His bones snapped back into place with a sickening crunch as his healing factor kick-started into overdrive. He sat up, gasping, his eyes blazing with a violet light so intense it illuminated the entire cavern. He looked at Valeria, not with hunger, but with awe. "You aren't just a descendant," he whispered, wiping the blood from his lips, looking at the glowing wound on her hand, before it began to knit itself shut. "Valeria, you are the sun." Plot twist. As the light from Silas's eyes illuminates the cavern walls, they see they aren't alone. The walls are covered in murals, ancient paintings depicting a king of night and a queen of sun joining hands to break a crown. It wasn't a war prophecy. It was a love story. The history books had lied. They didn't walk out of the mountains. They climbed out, fueled by a newfound purpose. The ascent took 2 grueling days through forgotten ventilation shafts and abandoned service tunnels, but they moved with a synchronization that needed no words. The revelation in the cave had changed everything. The war between vampires and the sun-touched hadn't been a war of extermination. It had been a war to prevent unity. The Elder Council, Augustus, the old bloodlines, they had feared the power that would come from the union of day and night. They had feared a king who didn't need the dark. They emerged from a rusted ventilation grate in the lower districts of Aoria 2 nights later. The city was burning. "Gwendolen didn't waste time," Silas observed grimly from the shadows of a rooftop. His coat was tattered, his face smeared with soot, but he stood taller than he ever had in the velvet robes of the court. Below them, the streets were chaos. The Iron Lotus was purging the slums, dragging families from their homes, marking doors with red paint. But there was resistance. People were fighting back. Humans and low-born vampires fighting side by side, throwing cobblestones and Molotov cocktails at the armored enforcers. Above the barricades flew makeshift banners bearing the broken crown. "Talia," Valeria smiled grimly, spotting the symbol. "She survived." "She started a riot," Silas corrected, watching a barricade burn. "We need to end this. Tonight." "How do we get into the citadel?" Valeria asked, looking at the distant fortress that loomed over the city like a blackened tooth. "The gates will be sealed. The air is patrolled by the fleet." Silas turned to her, adjusting the collar of the stolen coat he now wore. He looked less like a king and more like a warlord, dangerous, focused, lethal. "We don't sneak in, Valeria. I am done hiding in the dark." He walked to the edge of the roof, overlooking the main thoroughfare leading to the palace. He closed his eyes and extended his senses. It was a physical effort. Valeria could see the tension in his neck. He reached out to every vampire in the city, every thrall, every guard, every citizen who had ever sworn fealty to him. He didn't use a microphone. He used the blood link, the ancient, dormant connection between a maker and his subjects. "My people!" His voice echoed in the minds of 10,000 immortals simultaneously. It wasn't a shout. It was a whisper that drowned out the sirens. "You were told I abandoned you. You were told I chose a human over my duty. But I chose the future. Gwendolen offers you fear. She offers you a cage of silver and silence. I offer you the dawn." On the streets below, the fighting paused. Guards lowered their rifles. Iron Lotus members grabbed their heads, confused by the resonance. "If you want to be free," Silas commanded, his eyes opening, burning like twin stars, "open the gates." A mile away, the massive obsidian gates of the citadel groaned. The guards stationed there, men Silas had led for centuries, turned their weapons on the Iron Lotus commandos who tried to stop them. The gates swung open. "Show off," Valeria grinned, her heart racing. "Shall we?" Silas offered his arm, as if they were entering a ballroom and not a war zone. They walked down the center of the street. They didn't run. They walked. And behind them, a tide of people began to form. Vampires, humans, workers, nobles. The city was marching on the palace. They breached the inner sanctum without drawing a weapon. The sheer weight of Silas's presence, amplified by the conviction of his return, parted the sea of defenders. They reached the throne room. Gwendolen sat on the throne, the crown of Aoria resting uneasily on her head. Augustus Eldamore stood by her side, looking ancient and terrified. "You shouldn't have come back," Gwendolen said, her voice trembling slightly. She looked exhausted, the weight of her coup clearly heavier than she expected. "I have the council. I have the law." "You have a chair," Silas said, stepping into the room, Valeria at his side. "And you have a traitor." Silas pointed at Augustus. "Tell her, old man. Tell her why you really wanted Valeria dead." Augustus hissed, backing away toward the heavy velvet curtains. "She is an abomination. Her blood will unmake us." "Her blood is the key," Silas roared, his voice shaking the stained glass windows. The first king didn't conquer the sun touched. He loved her. Our immortality is a curse because it is incomplete. We burn in the sun because we rejected it." Silas turned to the court, to the dozens of nobles cowering along the walls. "I am not just the king of night. Tonight, I claim the day." He took Valeria's hand. He raised it high. "Kill them!" Augustus screamed, frothing at the mouth. Gwendolen stood up. She looked at Silas, standing tall and unafraid. She looked at Valeria, the human girl who had brought a king to his knees. Then she looked at the terrified old man beside her. She took off the crown. "I never wanted to rule," Gwendolen said quietly, the steel leaving her spine. "I just didn't want to die." She threw the crown at Augustus's feet. "He's yours." Plot twist. Augustus doesn't surrender. He laughs, a brittle, manic sound. He reaches into his robes and pulls out a glass sphere, pulsing with blinding white light. An ancient relic containing trapped, concentrated sunlight. The room explodes in blinding, searing white fire, designed to incinerate every vampire in the hall instantly. The light was blinding, a supernova in a bottle. Silas screamed as the holy fire washed over him. Gwendolen fell, her skin smoking, curling into a ball. The courtiers turned to ash where they stood, their screams cut short. But Silas didn't burn away. Valeria was holding him. She had thrown her arms around him the moment the sphere shattered, shielding him with her own body. And where her skin touched his, the fire didn't burn. It absorbed. Her blood was singing. The abomination that Augustus feared was a biological shield. She acted as a conduit, grounding the lethal energy, channeling it through her own body and into Silas. It hurt. A searing, white-hot agony that felt like her veins were being replaced with lightning. But she didn't let go. The energy surged into Silas, but instead of killing him, it changed him. Silas's eyes turned from violet to molten gold. His skin flushed with color, rosy, human color. The coldness of the grave evaporated, replaced by the warmth of a living sun. His heart, silent for centuries, gave a violent, thunderous kick. Thump, thump. The light faded. The throne room was a ruin of scorched stone and drifting ash. Augustus stood alone, unharmed by his own weapon, because he stood in the shadow of the throne, staring in horror at the smoke clearing in the center of the room. Silas Winterbourne stood there. He was breathing. He was warm. Steam curled off his shoulders. He looked at his hands, flexing fingers that were no longer pale marble, but flushed with life. He looked at Valeria, who was exhausted, her clothes singed, but alive and smiling. "What? What are you?" Augustus whispered, backing away until he hit the wall. Silas stepped forward. He didn't blur. He walked with the heavy, grounded step of a mortal man. He picked up the sword Gwendolen had discarded. The metal glowed orange where he touched it. "I am the balance," Silas said. He didn't kill Augustus. He simply raised the sword and brought it down on the elder's staff, the artifact used to control the wards of the city. The wood shattered. "The night is over, Augustus," Silas said, pointing the sword at the open door. "Get out of my city, run, while the shadows still exist to hide you." The elder fled, a shadow scurrying from the dawn. Silas turned to the room. The surviving vampires, those who had found cover, stared at him in awe. He had survived the pure sun. He was something new, a daywalker. But Silas didn't look at them. He dropped the sword, the clang echoing in the silence, and turned to Valeria. "You did it," he whispered, pulling her into his arms. His touch was warm, hot even. "You saved me." "I told you," she laughed, tears streaming down her face, washing away the soot. I prefer the sky." Silas looked out the shattered windows. The sun was rising over Aoria. For the first time, he didn't have to hide. He didn't have to retreat to the crypts. He walked Valeria to the balcony. The first rays of the morning sun hit his face. He closed his eyes and let it burn, warm and glorious. He kissed her, there in the light of the new day, in front of a city that was no longer afraid of the dark. Aoria didn't become a paradise overnight. There were scars to heal, treaties to rewrite, and a council to dismantle. But the fear was gone. Silas Winterborn, the king who walked in the sun, ruled not with a crown of iron, but with a partner who carried the dawn in her veins. They say that if you visit the citadel now, you won't find a throne room. You'll find a library, open to all, where a king and a queen sit by the window, reading poetry as the sun goes down. Because in the end, power wasn't about holding on. It was about finding the one hand worth holding. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story of survival, betrayal, and romance, please like this post and share it with your fellow book lovers. Don't forget to subscribe for more dark fantasy tales and serialized novels. Let me know in the comments, would you have chosen the crown or the cure?